In this video, I'm going to be giving away $10 trillion to a random subscriber. Zimbabwe dollars, baby!
We are not gay.
First, let's look at modern Zimbabwe. Sitting in the rump of Africa, Zimbabwe is made up of these borders and sitting at a population of about 15 million on this rather boring piece of land. The nation does not produce a whole lot of anything. How do they make their money then? For 2/3 of the country, they don't really. They just farm, usually at the sustenance level. That means they're self-sufficient, right? No nation is really self-sufficient, not even you, so the rest of the nation can trade to make up that difference. But wait, Zimbabwe is a landlocked nation. They need to get through both South Africa and Mozambique through these rivers in order to ship their goods off. That is unless they move it by train, still needing to rely on these two countries plus Zambia or Botswana now. And African borders are notorious for corruption and usually a little extra side cash is given to the officer when crossing. Meh, just think of it as a tariff. This all leads to Zimbabwe having one of the lowest rates of trading per capita on earth, and as you'll see later, they didn't keep great relations with any of their neighbors. Although if you included smuggling in their trade, the answer would be a lot higher. What could they possibly be smuggling? Marijuana? Meth? Heroin? Nah, more like flour, gold, and just a dash of cocaine. You might have heard it's because Zimbabwe is one of the largest gold producers on earth. I mean, it makes up half of their exports. Of course they produce a ton of it. But no, the gold production is relatively small with only about 30 tons produced a year. That's about the weight of a humpback whale, or a dead humpback whale because they don't have any oceans in Zimbabwe. Real great exports, huh? What they do have instead is platinum, chromium, and some lithium. Mining is Zimbabwe's big thing. It's the whole reason it was colonized in the first place. Pretty much every other industry is too uncompetitive for Zimbabwe to fight even its neighbors in, so they export things like gold, diamonds, nickel, and some tobacco for good luck, and import things like everything. At least everything you need for a modern country. Food, energy, chemicals, vehicles, clothes, industrial supplies. I don't want to go on, especially since they still barely import anything. This low level of trade makes them so vulnerable to swings in the domestic market, which means if times are good, they're pretty good. And if times are bad, they get worse than most other nations do. They can't minimize any shocks with outside trade. Let's get to the blunders then. First mistake, these guys. Look how friendly they are. Just imagine being posted up with the boys in a foreign land. Only one issue, there are still these fellas living here, the Ndebele. So by the 1880s there was an old African standoff. This is basically how it went. The British said, I want this land. Then the Portuguese came in and said, I want this land. Then the Boers came too and said, I want this land. And the Ndebele said, what the hell? This is my land. So the British told the king they'd give him guns and money if they could mine on the land. And after some thinking and debating, he said, you know what? Screw it. What's the worst that could happen? Except the British didn't actually own this land. One guy named Cecil Rhodes did, and they didn't believe in him.
God did.
Because now all of this land is called Rhodesia, and he's ruling with his divine right to take all the gold from his land. The mining operations actually failed at first, but they still set up some farms to tax food. Rhodesia was a couple of things. It was segregated, it was unequal, and it got a little more racist than the average late night gaming talk. The whites ruled the economy, ruled the country, and ruled the land, seizing it from the native Africans, forcing most of them to live on reserves. Only one problem though. Unlike these countries where the Brits came in such large numbers they dominated the country, the Brits were the vast minority in Rhodesia. About 50,000 around the 1930s compared to African numbers in the millions, leading to a country where a tiny fraction owned most of the farms, mines, businesses, land, and dollar bills. If you want to act like a pretentious political scientist, you could say Rhodesia was an exemplary case of extractive political and economic institutions set about by an external force for their ad interim growth. Or instead, you could say The Brits took all the Ndebele's things to make some quick cash. Whether from heavy taxes placed on native production, HUD taxes on every house, or marketing boards set up who usually took a little bonus for their hard work, Rhodesia was more unequal than a Nike sweatshop in Bangladesh. And as World War II started, causing hundreds of thousands of natives to move to the cities for fancy new manufacturing jobs, tensions only rose between the two groups. The 1950s and 60s saw a rise of militant anti-government groups like the ZAPU and the NDP. This NDP, not the Canadian one. As the groups grew and people kept urbanizing, there were open calls to get rid of the Rhodesian system. And when Nyasaland declared independence in the 60s, and then Northern Rhodesia did too, both under African rule, the South wanted to join the party and declared independence from the UK in 1965, instead under a white minority rule. It was inevitable. The British Empire was seriously declining and the UK was distancing itself from them. But right after, boom, the Rhodesian Bush War started and lasted for 15 years. No, not that kind of Bush War. It was the Rhodesians versus the Zimbabweans, aka whites versus blacks. It obviously caused destruction, countless deaths, and embargoes, so when the war was over, won by the ZANU-PF party, the new Zimbabwe was one of the most broken places on earth. Luckily, there was one man who promised to fix Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. The leader of ZANU-PF. Just kidding, guys. This man had no intention of making Zimbabwe a better place. Right after taking over, he killed about 20,000 political opponents and he got rid of the Rhodesian Senate. He was just a tiny bit corrupt, you know, setting up ZANU-PF allies to control newly made state-run industries, taking over marketing boards, and heavily regulating trade, so you had to buy from his party. One could call him a businessman doing business, but many others prefer the term crook. Instead of trying to get rid of these devastating ideas, he wanted to be the man running them. So obviously the old British colonists ran the hell away from this new country, taking much of the money and educated population with them. Some stayed. They still had farms, mines, and childhood memories here after all. Plus, any type of foreign investment that wanted to come back to Zimbabwe was shooed away. ZANU-PF wanted to fix the nation all by itself. So any independent Zimbabwean businessman trying to start up a shop selling, I don't know, plastic lids, couldn't from the heavy subsidies given to ZANU-PF-led industries, high costs from the lack of imports, and repression for genuine fear of ZANU-PF power being questioned. By the 1990s, this economic system failed though. After the Soviets collapsed, it wasn't really cool to have a command-based economy anymore, so they accepted loans from these guys to start a journey to the free market. No! Said the ZANU-PF supporters, who were the ones controlling all the state-led industries and getting a pretty nice paycheck for their work, so they protested and unrest continued throughout the 1990s. During that whole time, there was an idea, a break in case of emergency type idea. What if we took all the land from the white farmers and gave it to black farmers? Nah, that's too crazy, and the debate died down. Until 1998, and Zimbabwe went to fight in the Second Congo War mainly to protect Mugabe's investments in the country. Turns out that was an incredibly unpopular move, and countries cut their aid to Zimbabwe, they cut trade, they cut political ties, and most importantly, their old pals South Africa did all of this too. They were a pariah on the world stage, and it led to deindustrialization, riots over rising food prices, war veterans demanding land, and defaulting on their loans in 2000. The 2000 election in Zimbabwe was one full of violence, fraud, and likely the most important in its history. ZANU-PF won by only a slight margin with a little help from some certain gunmen. So why not gain some popularity and maybe try that idea out? By 2000, the government started seizing white-owned land to give to the war veterans, but let's be honest, to ZANU-PF elites too. Over 3,000 of them in total, and I think this graph shows the state of the economy best. Before 2000, growing somewhat stable. After 2000, it really took a nosedive. Imagine you lived your whole life in the city and then I grabbed you and threw you on this piece of land and said, "Farm, boy." What would you even do? My guess is you'd be a pretty lousy farmer, and yeah, with the lack of training and dismantling white equipment and businesses, these new farmers destroyed agriculture in Zimbabwe. Food supplies halved, down 45% in the years that followed, and they couldn't just import the rest, cause, say it together, everybody hates Zimbabwe. Remember, this is a country that already lost its trade and manufacturing. All they had left was farming, and that was collapsing now too. It's kind of like when Kanye lost his family, all he had left was Adidas, and then he became a Nazi and he lost Adidas too. Just replace this interview with seizing white farms, and that's the story of Zimbabwe. Businesses completely stopped investing in Zimbabwe when they realized the government could just snatch their investment from them and shut it down. Well, imagine this with farms and factories instead. And the US and EU put massive sanctions on Zimbabwe, with one of the goals seriously being to make the people revolt and overthrow the ZANU-PF government. Food became unaffordable, there was violence and riots in the streets, and the government ran out of money. The only way to pay the elites and veterans was to... No, don't look at that, Zimbabwe. You can do better. Production, diamonds, drug smuggling, taxes, I don't care. Anything but that. Oh, but it's so tempting. Maybe just a little bit could do some good. 'Cause swoosh! The government became addicted to printing money. At peak printing in late 2008, inflation was around 80 billion% monthly and 90 sextillion% yearly, but honestly they stopped measuring. It was so high that everyone was just honestly making these stats up. They printed so much money that the paper it was printed on was way more valuable than the dollar itself, leading to things like the $10 trillion bill, and the hyperinflation wiped out everybody's savings, destroyed any business's savings, and obliterated the government's savings. The black market was the only realistic way to buy food, goods, and to find any work, with some bread reaching $20 billion in the non-black market. After the banks collapsed, they had to switch to other currencies like the South African rand and US dollar for any sort of stability. And if you think they learned from their mistakes, wrong. In 2013, these land-grabbing laws were extended to some white-owned businesses. You can imagine how that went. Today, less than 300 farms in Zimbabwe have been given back to white farmers, and in 2019 they brought back the Zimbabwean dollar, this time only reaching 350% inflation in 2021. So hey, kudos to them for improving. Food security is uncertain, life expectancy is low, and it's still very politically repressive. Not the best for running a country, but whether it's Brits taking African land or Zimbabweans taking white-owned land, what I can say is they knew a thing or two about how to run an economy. Of course they knew how to run an economy. Which other country has had as many trillionaires as Zimbabwe has? None.